What is AngularJS? So AngularJS is an MVC framework for efficiently creating dynamic views with a web browser using HTML and JavaScript. And notice how I have efficiently bolded and underscored. There's a lot of different frameworks out there that claim to do dynamic views with HTML and JavaScript. We got jQuery, Knockout, a bunch of different frameworks like that. However, I'm going to make the argument here that AngularJS is by far the most efficient framework for doing this that's currently available out there. Some highlights and focuses of AngularJS. It's a complete application framework. What I mean by that is it fully replaces jQuery. So everything that you would use jQuery for normally, so say you'd use jQuery to create a slideshow widget on a page or, hide and show things, stuff like that. AngularJS completely replaces jQuery for, very simple cases like that. However, what it also does, which is really awesome, is you can scale everywhere from a very simple jQuery replacement all the way up to creating a massive enterprise single-page application with Angular. So what I mean by that is you can have a massive frame application that's got hundreds, if not thousands, of different pages in it, and Angular will do everywhere from essentially from A to Z, which a lot of other frameworks that are out there can't claim to be able to do. Another huge thing, and probably the biggest thing for Angular for me, is that it's fully dynamic MVVM with POJOs. What I mean by that is it does MVVM with plain old JavaScript objects, and this is huge. So say you've used Knockout before, right? Knockout does not have plain old JavaScript objects. You have to create observables with Knockout. AngularJS, however, actually uses JavaScript how it's meant to be used. So everything is dynamic, so you can take an object and dynamically assign a field to it, and you can get two-way data binding there. This is huge because it saves you a lot of time in essentially redefining stuff. Say you have a .NET type, a person object, and with Knockout you'd actually have to redefine the person object in JavaScript. With Angular you don't have that problem because it just uses plain old JavaScript objects, and we'll get into this. However, it is a huge time saver. Also, another thing that AngularJS does, I mentioned it's a full jQuery replacement, so it also does low-level DOM manipulation. So you can use AngularJS to do low-level DOM manipulation since it replaces jQuery. However, what you'll find is that in using AngularJS, I would say 95% of the time you will never need to do DOM manipulation, which is awesome because DOM manipulation is very difficult and abstracted often. And how you do this with Angular is you can use directives. However, most of the time you can just use templating, and that'll be sufficient for manipulating the DOM, but you won't be directly manipulating it with code. You'll be using templating. Also, since Angular replaces jQuery, it also provides full AJAX interaction, so you don't need to use jQuery for AJAX anymore. And another awesome thing that it does is that jQuery does not do is that it also provides RESTful API interaction. So there's a module called Resource, which allows you to interact with a RESTful endpoint in probably about the most terse way that I've ever seen. Also, another thing that AngularJS does really well is it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of code organization, but it does require that you organize your code at least a little bit, which, building a jQuery application, we've probably all seen some spaghetti code out there for jQuery, and AngularJS really gives you some guidelines in terms of how you should probably organize your code. Another thing that really helps you organize your code and eliminate that jQuery spaghetti code mess is that it has dependency injection. So you actually, just like how you would in .NET or any server-side language, you can actually inject things in, and this leads to a lot better code organization. But other stuff is it just makes it a lot more testable, and Angular really from the ground up is meant to be testable, so this really helps. Another thing, kind of as I mentioned, is that Angular offers comprehensive single-page application support with routing. So there's actually a built-in router in Angular, and there's also another one out there called Angular UI Router, which really helps for building out. Like Angular UI Router is a lot more advanced than the built-in Angular router, and depending on what your application's needs are, you can say, I don't need a router at all. You don't pull it in, you don't waste the application's payload size on the client, or you can pull in Angular's built-in router, or you can pull in the Angular UI router. It's up to you whether you need a single-page app or not. You're not required to do it, though. Why should I care about Angular? Well, first off, pretty much everything out there, it's open source, right? Angular's open source, Backbone's open source, jQuery's open source. So this isn't really a big thing in and of itself. I mean, if it wasn't open source, then this would be a major red flag for Angular, but it's good that it's open source, right? Here's one thing that a lot of those other frameworks cannot claim, though. AngularJS is actively being developed by Google. And what I mean by that is Google actually has 20 full-time employees that are, Google Smart full-time employees that are getting paid to actively develop Angular. So this is huge. And to be honest with you, it gives Angular a huge unfair advantage over all the other frameworks out there, because pretty much every other framework that I'm aware of is, for doing MVVM JavaScript type stuff is all being done as someone's side project. So Knockout is someone's side project, Backbone is someone's side project, but Google has invested a lot of time and money into building out Angular and making it into a great framework. And so say you're probably thinking, well, what if Google decides, hey, we don't want to work on this anymore? Well, they do that a lot, right? Google is kind of ADD when it comes to frameworks, but another huge thing with Angular, since it's open source, is that it has a huge community. It's being actively developed on GitHub. So let's say Google walks away from it. Well, guess what? Google won't be administrating the project anymore, but since it's open source, we could have other people that are administrating it later on that, it's their side project or something like that. So Angular is not going to dry up and go away even if Google walks away from it, but it's a huge advantage that Google is actively developing it right now. So I'm going to make a bold statement right now. From what I've seen, AngularJS appears to be the #1 framework out there. And let's take a look at, and for good reason I might add, let's take a look at some evidence for this, and we'll see what you think. Why should I care? First thing, why should I care about Angular? Well, Google Trends. So when I'm starting a new project and I'm thinking, well, all right, what are some frameworks that are out there that I might want to consider using? Well, one thing that I always like to do is I like to just pop it into Google Trends. And Google Trends kind of gives you an overview of what people are searching for on Google. Now, it's often difficult. You have to take this with a grain of salt. It's often difficult to come up with a good search string to really match everything. I mean, and the other side of the grain of salt too is that, well, what if people are searching for AngularJS because it's really confusing, right? So that could be another thing. But take a look at this graph, right? Of all the different sort of popular frameworks out there, Angular, since last year really has just taken off like a rocket ship, and everything else is just kind of chugging along. So in terms of searches out there, I mean, Angular is just far and exceeding, and I would only expect that as time goes on that this rocket ship is going to keep going up, as you can kind of see from the upward trajectory of it right now. So if you're looking for a popularity contest, Angular definitely seems to be winning that right now. As far as other popularity contests, so all these projects are open source, right? So they're all on GitHub, and we can kind of look at the statistics on GitHub. So I pulled in all these other frameworks that are popular and really competition. So Angular, Ember, Backbone, and Knockout. As you can see, in terms of all important aspects of GitHub statistics, Angular is still #1 there. So as of when this was compiled, we have 22,000 stars on GitHub, over 22,000 stars. So that means someone went on GitHub and gave it a star because they're interested in it. Also, over 2,000 watches. So this is people that are actually more interested in Angular, actively watching what's happening as the framework evolves. There's also a lot of forks. Forks are when people fork the code with the intention of committing something in. And as you can see, Angular has a lot of forks, way more than any of the other frameworks. And also, just in terms of activity, commits in the past month, Angular has 859, which that means it's an extremely active project. And I mean, the next highest one is like a quarter of that. So that's pretty huge. Also, Angular has a lot of authors. So I did mention there's 20 full-time Google employees that are working on Angular. However, you can see that we have 195 different authors. So Angular really is an open source project. It's not just Google building it out. There's a lot of active community involvement, which is awesome. Also, it's had 21 major releases in the past year, which means that they're really, and you'll see this as you start to follow Angular, they're really chugging out, like probably every couple of weeks they're chugging out a new release, and it might be a beta or a major or a minor version. However, they're really trying to improve the framework as it goes on, and you might look at that and say, well, does that mean that it's unstable? Well, I'll just give you some anecdotal evidence here. I've been using Angular for about the last year, and every time a new release comes out, I always upgrade to it, and I've never had any issues with it breaking. So they have really high unit test coverage, and testing is very important to the team. So you can kind of be ensured that as time goes on and you upgrade, you're really getting new features, and you're probably not going to get a whole lot of bugs, which is pretty cool. All right, so we were talking about all these other libraries in terms of their popularity on GitHub and their popularity on Google Trends. Well, let's actually talk about them and kind of compare and contrast how they all look on sort of a level playing field. So this is my Venn diagram of different frameworks. And what I'd like to point out, so AngularJS is the black circle, right? And AngularJS does probably the most of all these frameworks right now. And you can see, you're probably familiar with jQuery, right? You can see there's a little bit of overlap with jQuery there. So that's that blue circle over there on the left. As I mentioned, AngularJS will do DOM manipulation, and however, it fully replaces jQuery. In fact, another cool thing about Angular is if you have jQuery referenced in the DOM before Angular is referenced, it'll actually use jQuery internally. But if you don't have it referenced, it uses something called jQuery Lite. So AngularJS is fully replacing jQuery, but you see jQuery is over kind of outside the Venn diagram, and that's because AngularJS says, okay, for animations and stuff like that, you're supposed to use CSS3. So if you need to let's say you're like, okay, I can't use CSS3, I need to support IE8 or whatever, you can pull in jQuery, you can use it. However, you're not required to. And another interesting fact is that AngularJS, with all that it does, it's actually more lightweight than the version 1 of jQuery, so the 1.0 branch, which is pretty awesome. So it actually weighs a couple kilobytes less than jQuery does, which is pretty amazing. So some other popular frameworks, right? Backbone and Knockout. You can see there is some overlap between Backbone and Knockout, but AngularJS, what it does fully encompasses what both Backbone and Knockout do. So Backbone provides some organization for your JavaScript code, and all Knockout does is MVVM, but AngularJS completely encompasses everything that they do. Really, the only fair comparison to AngularJS right now is Ember, and as you can see, I would argue that AngularJS does a bit more than Ember does, but you can see there's a huge amount of overlap between the two frameworks. So let's take a look and dig in a little bit more on this Venn diagram. So let's compare AngularJS directly to jQuery. So it's not really a fair comparison to compare AngularJS to jQuery. The only thing that jQuery is meant to do is for doing DOM manipulation, animations, and as an AJAX wrapper. It's not a complete application framework like what Angular is. Some pros of jQuery versus Angular. I tried, but I really couldn't come up with anything that jQuery does. Other than animations that Angular cannot do. And really, Angular has built-in jQuery, and it's really lightweight. So, and as I mentioned, if you add jQuery to the page, Angular will start to use it. But as we're probably all aware as developers that have used jQuery has a lot of cons, and really the biggest con is it's just, through a lot of experience on my part, it's a horrible choice for creating dynamic UIs. The code that you write is extremely verbose and is extremely abstracted from the DOM. So writing code with selectors to manipulate the DOM it's very verbose and very difficult. And how Angular does this differently is with templates. And another thing that jQuery does, let's say you want to do two-way binding or something equivalent to that. Well, jQuery doesn't provide any mechanism to do that. It's not MVVM or MVC. So you're going to need to write your two-way binding yourself. And something that you could do in one line with Angular is probably going to take about 10 lines. I've found that my Angular code is probably about 10% of what jQuery code would have been, and it's much easier to maintain and much more straightforward. So a little bit kind of moving on, a little bit more fair comparison to Angular is probably BACKBONE.JS. So BACKBONE.JS has, basically we all realized that jQuery had some issues with being organized, and what BACKBONE.JS does is it's really designed to provide structure to applications that are built on jQuery. So some other stuff that it does is it has some model support, view support, it does templating, basic routing, and it provides for RESTful interactions. So this is more of a application framework type thing. Probably the only pro that I could think of to Backbone with Angular is that Backbone is older and more mature. So if you look at Backbone, it's been around for a while. However, that kind of leads right into the cons. Backbone.js is old, mature, and really, to be honest, it's met all of the requirements that it was set out to be developed for. So it's a previous, and what I mean by that is a previous generation application framework. So it's met all the goals. Some reasons that I say this is because it doesn't provide for MVVM support without add-ons. So there are some ways that you can kind of hack MVVM into Backbone. However, it's not part of the framework, and it's not really designed to do that. So instead of using MVVM, you're going to use jQuery for doing DOM manipulation. And with that, as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to use jQuery to do DOM manipulation, you're probably going to end up with about 10 times as much code as you would have had with Angular. And I always like to have less code to maintain. As long as it's straightforward is awesome. Also, Backbone doesn't have dependency injection, and it's not really designed from the ground up to be testable like Angular is. So that's a huge thing. It's also not really meant to be a full-featured framework. In fact, it's really meant to be a lightweight thing. And if you look at Backbone, the actually modification of the source code to fit your own particular needs is encouraged. And if you look at that, modifying the source code for a library, that could be problematic if you want to pull in newer versions of it. But really, it's meant to be lightweight and customized, and it's not really meant to be this massive application framework to kind of do whatever you want. And as I kind of touched on earlier, it's extremely verbose for what you get. Since you're using jQuery for everything, you don't have any MVVM. With Backbone, you've provided some structure to your jQuery applications. However, you really haven't gotten at the underlying point that jQuery is extremely verbose for what you get. And Backbone, kind of as we saw by looking at the GitHub statistics, it's not very actively developed anymore. So there's not a whole lot of people that are working on it anymore. And again, that's because it's already met its goals. So another comparison people probably make is comparing AngularJS to Knockout, right? So Knockout.js is a library that provides MVVM-style data bindings using observables and dependency tracking. And really the only pros, and I've used Knockout for a couple of years here before I switched over to using Angular, the only pros that I could come up with Knockout is that it is possibly more performant under some situations. However, just using my experience here, so I took an entire Knockout application that was a little bit slow and rewrote the entire thing in Angular. And what I found was that, and this Knockout application was written in Durandal, which is a single-page application framework for Knockout. What I found, though, in switching over is that my code, first off, I probably had about a 50% code reduction by switching to Angular. Some of that's due to refactoring. But what's really interesting is that, theoretically, Knockout should be more performant than how Angular works, because Angular does dirty tracking and Knockout actually does dependency tracking. But what I found is when we rewrote the application, the first thing the user said was, wow, this is a whole lot faster. And we actually discovered some race conditions as a result of Angular being so much faster. So we actually had to change some of our server-side code that we didn't even realize was a race condition as a result. So just from my experience, I found that Angular is actually faster than Knockout. And that's really the only possible pro that I could see to Knockout. However, using Knockout for the last 2 years, it's not a super fair comparison to Angular, because Knockout, all it is designed to do is to do MVVM with two-way data binding, right? That's all it's supposed to do. It's not a complete application framework to kind of solve all of your problems. And some other things that I've encountered with Knockout is, right when you get started with Knockout, you realize this right away. It's pretty complicated and error-prone, so you might spend half an hour thinking, I for sure found a bug in the framework in Knockout. But what you found is, you forgot to execute an observable. And why this is kind of the biggest con for Knockout, is that the dependency tracking and the computeds and everything like that, they're all functions. So you have to remember that. So you're not using a plain old JavaScript object. You actually are executing functions. And Knockout has some syntactic sugar in HTML, which allows you to, not execute the function if you're doing a very simple expression. But this becomes pretty confusing and error prone, especially when you're starting out with Knockout. And kind of, this is just sort of my feeling with Knockout and anyone I've ever talked to about using Knockout. Like it works really well for like whiz-bang demos. You're like, wow, that's really cool. But when complicated things start to go wrong with Knockout, it's really difficult to figure out why. And that, again, is really just because Knockout does not use plain old JavaScript objects. You essentially have to, so say you have a person object on your server-side code in C#, right? And you want to do MVVM and you want to interact with that person object. You want to push it down into view in JavaScript. You're actually going to have to recreate the person object type in your view in JavaScript. I actually created an entire framework to kind of help with that and actually create these objects for you, these observable objects that are required for Knockout. So, but it's funny. So I made this whole framework to do that, to scan all your types in your assembly and essentially create all of these observable things for you. So say you want to create a new person in the UI. Well, you're going to need to define a JavaScript type with observables on it just to do that. So I created a framework to do that. And it's funny, coming into Angular, you don't even need that because Angular's dynamic, so if you have a first name field, it will apply that right onto an object. So huge amount of time savings and avoiding of code duplication by using Angular. So it's also, I touched on this a little bit, it's all Knockout's designed to do is MVVM. It's not a full-blown application framework. And another thing with Knockout that I've sort of found in using it is that it's not very testable. It's not designed to be testable. And you can run into the same sort of code and organization issues with Knockout as you would with doing a jQuery application. So probably the most fair comparison to Angular right now out there is Ember.js. And its sort of goals as a framework is to be a full-fledged framework for building out web applications. And basically the same goals as AngularJS, but just kind of digging into Ember a little bit. What I've found is that it lacks a lot of the advantages that AngularJS has. So you have to, just like Knockout, use observables, special objects, and you have to do getters and setters with strings. So you can't just use plain old JavaScript objects, and it's not dynamic. So you're going to run into that same issue that you have with Knockout, where you have to redefine your types in the view and from the server. And really the goals of Ember is for ambitious, I think their website says, ambitious large web applications. It's not really meant to do the full gamut of application stuff out there. So it's not meant to do like one-off little jQuery replacements. It's really meant to be a big single-page application. And kind of digging through their docs and messing with it, and just kind of from what I've heard online too, it's probably a bit more complicated than Angular is. But some people that are really big proponents of Ember claim that once you get past the complication, it's more efficient. However, it's extremely complicated to learn up front, and it's also very opinionated. So just like Backbone, you have to extend their built-in object bases. And so we get past all of that, and we try to compare Ember. So we get past all of that, and we say, all right, well, at the end of the day, Angular is way more popular than Ember is. We saw that from the Google Trends statistics out there. We also saw that on GitHub. And to be honest, I haven't really heard in the community many people talking about Ember much. It's really just Angular is just taking off like a rocket ship. So, if you want to go with the most popular framework, which I think is a very relevant consideration to make for finding developers and also for finding documentation, finding blog posts, and having people help you on Stack Overflow, you maybe don't want to go with Ember just because of that.